In this level, we're going to graph aggregate demand and aggregate supply and compare it to potential GDP. This will help us determine whether our economy is in a recessionary gap or an expansionary, or also called inflationary gap. So we need to figure out the status of our economy. So we need to know the equilibrium size of our economy, so what is real GDP, and we need to compare it to our potential. How big could we be? So let's start by first looking at aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So aggregate demand is the total value of all final goods and services that consumers, businesses, government, those living outside the country, that they're willing and able to buy from businesses inside our country at different price levels. So if you think about the demand for everything from McDonald's hamburgers to chairs to cars, to accounting services and everything in between, aggregate demand, the term aggregate just means total or sum. So we're adding up all the demand for all the goods and services produced in our country. And that takes us back to the discussion we had about who demands the goods and services in our country. And if you recall, the total spending in our economy, aggregate expenditures, is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus IM. So when we look at total spending in our economy, we can break it down based on who does it. We have households doing consumption spending, businesses doing investment spending, government spending, and then we have export spending, where people in other countries buy our goods. And then, of course, we have to subtract away the import spending, because that's where we're buying goods or services from other countries. So our aggregate demand, we proved in the last level, comes from this aggregate expenditures, the total spending in our economy, and looks at how it changes when we change the price level. So where does that aggregate demand come from? Well, in the previous level, we derived aggregate demand by looking at how our autonomous spending changes when the price changes. And we can narrow it down really to three effects that create this downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So the first was the real balance effect. So if the price falls, prices of goods fall, then that means that the money in our savings account, so the value of our savings, it now goes farther. Because prices are lower, the money in our savings, we can use it to buy more goods. So the value of our savings increases. And if the value of our savings increases, then that means that we don't have to save as much for the future. So savings will decrease, and our autonomous consumption will increase, and that will cause our aggregate expenditures to increase. And so you'll recall, we had our aggregate expenditure function here and our 45-degree line here. And so the real balance effect says prices fall, aggregate expenditures will increase. And so what we see is that national income went up. And we know that we can measure the size of our economy in terms of national income or gross domestic product. So as the price went down, real GDP went up because our national income went up. So the real balance effect is one of the reasons that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. Prices fall, the value of our savings goes up, we save less, we consume more, and that's going to make aggregate expenditures go up, which then puts us at a higher equilibrium when prices are lower. So price goes down, real GDP goes up. The other things that are causing aggregate demand to be downward sloping are the interest rate effect and the foreign trade effect. So the interest rate effect says when prices go down, what happens to interest rates? Well, when prices go down, interest rates go down, and that's because of the Fisher effect. Recall the Fisher effect says that our nominal interest rates are made up of a real interest rate, so compensation for being without your money, as well as anticipated inflation. If we anticipate more inflation, we think that prices will be higher, then we have to make sure those who are lending money, that when they get their money back, it buys what it bought before, which is why interest rates go up when there's inflation. And so the same thing happens with interest rates going down. So when prices go down, interest rates go down as well. Well, if interest rates go down, it's now cheaper for businesses to borrow, so investment spending will go up, which will make our aggregate expenditures go up, and that means that we now have a higher equilibrium. National income is higher, so GDP is higher, and that happens when the price level goes down. So we're getting our downward sloping demand curve. The last one here is the foreign trade effect. And the foreign trade effect says that when prices go down, well, people in other countries now want to buy more of our goods, so export spending goes up. We also see that when prices go down domestically, we'd rather buy from home, so imports go down. And if exports are going up and imports are going down, then our net exports are going up. And since aggregate expenditures is C plus I plus G plus X minus IM, when net exports goes up, aggregate expenditures goes up, and our national income increases, our real GDP increases, and all that's happening when the prices fall. So aggregate demand is downward sloping because the real balance effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign trade effect. Recall that aggregate demand shows the total value of our final goods and services, so our real GDP, and how that is changing with the price level. So we changed the price level in these three here, and it changed aggregate expenditures, which changes the amount that households, businesses, government, rest of the world is willing and able to buy of our goods. Now, let's look at what would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. So what are the determinants of aggregate demand? Well, the determinants of aggregate demand are those same things that were changing autonomous aggregate expenditures. So let's make a list here. All right, so we want to know what will cause aggregate demand to shift. And since aggregate demand comes from aggregate expenditures, C plus I plus G plus X minus IM, and how these aggregate expenditures change when we change the price, we can now look at what's going to change aggregate expenditures besides the price. So if there's a price change, we're simply moving along or creating the aggregate demand curve. But everything else that changed aggregate expenditures will shift the graph. So let's think back to what changed autonomous aggregate expenditures, right? Here's our aggregate expenditure function. Here's our 45-degree line. What else changed aggregate expenditures besides price? So let's start with consumption. What changed autonomous consumption? Well, when we think back, we have a list of things that change autonomous consumption. We talked about an increase in wealth. If the stock market was doing well, then your income hasn't changed, but you're now willing to buy more things. So that made autonomous consumptions to increase, which would shift up aggregate expenditures. So an increase in wealth increases aggregate expenditures and therefore increases aggregate demand. All right, what were the other things that changed autonomous consumption spending? We had the age of durable goods. Remember, durable goods are goods that are long lasting. This was furniture, electronics, things like that. And if your durable goods get old, then you're going to buy more of them, and that's going to increase aggregate demand, or shift the graph to the right. All right, what if consumers become pessimistic about the future. So if consumers think that their future income is going to fall, they're worried about jobs, they think the economy is going into a recession, what does that do to their demand for goods and services? Well, it makes aggregate demand decrease. And a decrease in aggregate demand is a shift to the left. Okay. So those are things that change consumption spending. Let's look at investment spending. So what were those things that changed investment spending that weren't price? Because remember, a price change is a movement along the aggregate demand curve. Anything else that changes autonomous investment spending will shift the demand curve. So what if there is a change in the age of capital goods? Okay. So if capital goods, if the machines in your business are getting old, so let's just put some arrows here so we know the age of our durable goods in the previous one were going up, they're getting older. The age of our capital goods are increasing, they're getting older. Well, if capital goods are getting old, then you need to replace them. That increases aggregate expenditures, increases the equilibrium size of our economy, but it's not a price change, so it's shifting aggregate demand. So capital goods get older, demand for goods, in this case capital goods, increases. The graph shifts to the right. Then we have, what if there is a decrease in spare capacity? So what if businesses have less storage space, warehousing space? If there's a decrease in spare capacity, then they're going to need to expand their business, which means they're going to need to buy more space. And this means an increase in demand for goods and services. What if there is an increase in government regulations? There's an increase in government regulations. So let's say there's now more hoops to jump through. You have to get more inspections when you're running your business. So there's a lot more bureaucracy. Well, if there's a lot more bureaucracy, then as a business, you're less likely to expand, find new locations, increase your capital goods and your inventory. So the more hoops the businesses have to jump through, their demand for goods and services will decrease. And that is a shift to the left. All right, what else do we have that changes autonomous investment spending? What if businesses are pessimistic about the future? So if businesses think the economy's not doing well, they're not going to expand, they're not going to increase their number of capital goods, so aggregate demand will decrease. Okay. And the last one that impacts investment spending is a change in monetary policy. So the Bank of Canada, our central bank, sets monetary policy, and part of that is a change in interest rates. Now, interest rates do change because of inflation or deflation, and that is part of what derived the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. But we can also change interest rates to speed up or slow down the economy. So let's look at monetary policy where we're changing interest rates separate from a price change. So with monetary policy, we could decide to increase interest rates. And if we increase interest rates, then now it's more expensive for businesses to borrow. And if businesses don't borrow as much, they don't spend as much, and aggregate demand will decrease or shift to the left. Interest rates can also be impacted by the amount of government debt. If the government has a large amount of debt, then people are less likely to loan them money for deficit spending in the future. In which case, to entice other countries, to entice domestic investors, to basically lend money to the government, then they have to raise interest rates. So a large amount of government debt can also drive up interest rates, which decreases aggregate demand because it's now more expensive for businesses to borrow to expand their business. Now, when we talk about the government borrowing money, what they're doing is they're issuing bonds. Government bonds are really just the government selling debt, and there's a rate of return on those bonds, and that's a rate of interest. All right, so we have consumption spending that can change aggregate demand, so either an increase in wealth, a change in the age of durable goods, or consumers being more optimistic or pessimistic about the future. We had investment spending. Changes in investment spending include capital goods getting older, a change in spare capacity, change in government regulations, firms being more optimistic or pessimistic about the future, and changes in monetary policy or interest rates from government debt. All right, C, I, then G. Okay, this would be our fiscal policy. And fiscal policy consists of two things: government spending and taxes. All right, see if we can't get that back here. All right, government spending and taxes. If government spending increases, that's the government buying more goods and services, that's going to make aggregate demand increase, or the graph shift to the right. So if you think about the government trying to stimulate the economy, what they're trying to do is increase demand. And so government, they need to buy hospitals, they need to buy police cars. All this government spending increases demand for goods and services made by businesses in Canada. All right, then we have taxes. So the other part of fiscal policy is a change in taxes. And if you change taxes, for example, you make taxes go down, then that means, if we're talking about taxes to households, that gives them more disposable income, and they're going to buy more goods and services. If those taxes impact companies, then companies will be more likely to expand their business, get more capital goods if they're paying less in taxes. All right, so we have C plus I plus G, and we have X minus IM. Okay. And here we're looking at exports and imports, so let's think back to what changed net exports and changed aggregate expenditures. Because if you change aggregate expenditures and it's not driven by price, then you're changing aggregate demand. All right, so what if the Canadian dollar appreciates, gains value? So if the Canadian dollar strengthens, then Canadians, they're going to buy more foreign goods, so imports will increase. And if the Canadian dollar appreciates, then that means that other currencies have depreciated, lost value, so that means foreigners can't afford to buy as much from us. So if the Canadian dollar appreciates, net exports will decrease, and that'll cause aggregate demand to decrease or shift to the left. What if there is a decrease in foreign income? So if the American economy is suffering, so Americans have less income, then they're going to buy less from us, so exports will fall, which means net exports will fall, and aggregate demand will decrease. What if the price of foreign goods increase? So foreign goods get more expensive, then imports are going to go down. Foreigners would rather buy from us because we're cheaper, because their price of their goods is higher, so exports will go up. That means X minus IM will go up, and aggregate demand will therefore increase. All right, there's one more that impacts net exports. Do you remember what it is? In this case, it's a preference. for goods, let's say there is a decrease in preference for foreign goods. So if Canadians like foreign goods less, then imports will fall and aggregate demand will increase. Because remember, we subtract away the imports, and so they reduce our total spending because that's money going to other countries. If we're going to import less, then aggregate demand will increase. All right, so we had things that changed consumption spending. We had things that changed investment spending. We had changes to fiscal policy. Okay. That could also be the government deciding how to deal with their debt. If the government decides to pay off its debt, then government spending will go down, aggregate demand will go down, taxes will go up because they need more tax revenue to pay off the debt, and aggregate demand will decrease. Exports, we talked about what impacts them. So we had 4 of those. And there's one last thing that will change aggregate demand, and that's the other change in monetary policy, which is changing the money supply. So if the money supply increases, if the Bank of Canada decides to print more money, there's now more cash floating around, everybody's got tons, and how do you make money off your money? Well, you lend it out. So if there's an increase in the money supply, then everyone has money to lend out. It's easy to find someone to borrow from. And who do you borrow from? You borrow from whoever gives you the lowest rate. So when the money supply increases, interest rates are actually going to fall because you have lots of choices of who to borrow from. So you're going to borrow from whomever gives you the lowest rate. And when interest rates go down, we know that that causes investment spending to go up, which means demand for goods and services will do what? It'll go up. So when we talk about what changes aggregate demand, there are lots of determinants of aggregate demand. An increase in wealth, a change in the age of durable goods, being more optimistic or pessimistic about the future from the perspective of the consumer, age of capital goods, change in spare capacity, change in government regulations, a firm being more optimistic or pessimistic about the future, changes in monetary policy, changing the money supply or the interest rates, changes in fiscal policy, changes in the value of the Canadian dollar, appreciating or depreciating, a change in foreign income, change in domestic or foreign goods compared to each other, and a change in preference for foreign goods. All of these will shift the aggregate demand curve. In our future video, we're going to start changing aggregate demand and look at what it does to the size of the economy. So it's very important we know these determinants of demand so we know what would cause aggregate demand to increase or decrease, and that's going to change the size of our economy.